Welcome to the third in the series of our speaker series for this fall of 2023. This is the theme is sustainable sites. My name is Britton Rogers. I'm executive director here at Yes Tomorrow. We're speaking to you from Waitsfield, Vermont, on the ancestral lands of the Abenaki people. I have to say, before I get going, the Sustainable Sites program overall and this speaker series in general is really thanks to our guest speakers tonight and the organization they represent. So much of their hard work has gone into inspiring and driving what it is Yes Tomorrow is trying to pursue in this long-term plan of engaging more people in the topic of sustainable sites, quote unquote sustainable sites, and exploring what that even means, those two words put together. So without saying too much more about that, I'll let you all hear from them. And then in the final lecture of the series on November 15th is when I will be going into what exactly that means for Yes Tomorrow. And I'll be referencing what I assume we'll be talking about tonight quite a bit. A few details. The talk will run from 6:30 to 7:30, so about an hour. And then there will be time for question and answer afterward. People on Zoom, please feel free to add questions to the chat or the Q&A feature, and we'll be monitoring those. For those of you here in person, there are bathrooms that way in the lobby, refreshments here. We have some Yes Tomorrow staff, instructors, etc. So happy to have everyone here. I like to always make sure and announce the Standby for Locals program. We have a program where if there's space available in classes, as the classes get close, we have a 50% discount for residents of Washington County. So be sure to stay on the lookout for that and sign up to be getting news about that. And so then just a little bit about Friends of the Mad River, the Ridge to River program, and our speakers. Friends of the Mad River was founded in 1986, I think. 86. So Yes Tomorrow was a wee 6 years old, and Friends of the Mad River was hard on its heels, doing some amazing work here in the Valley. And one of the programs that they work on and they've established is called the Ridge to River program, and it's a 5-town coalition working toward clean water and flood resilience in the Mad River Valley. We have one of our speakers is Luke Foley, who lives on the banks of the Mad River, and he is a climate and engagement manager for Friends of the Mad River. He has an extensive background as an outdoor educator. You're an adjunct professor at Holyoke and Castleton. I didn't know that. That's exciting. And lives, as I said, on the banks of the Mad in Waitsfield with his wife and 2 children. And he told me to say, if you see little children jumping in the river at odd times of year, they're probably his. And then I added also following in his footsteps. Ira Shadis, our other speaker, is the executive director of Friends of the Mad River. Grew up in the arms of the Winooski River, home up in the headwaters, school on the main stem, summer days swimming in the Mad, a tributary of the Winooski. His professional life is focused on the cross-section of environmental stewardship, education, and communication, making him a perfect choice for executive director of Friends of the Mad River, and a perfect choice for one of our speakers tonight. So I'll turn it over to the 2 of them.
Yeah. Get oriented here. Mic's all good. You guys can hear me. I think I might actually go to the other. No, you adjusted. Cool. Thank you for coming out tonight. People online, thank you for joining as well. So we're going to talk about building a resilient community from Ridge to River. The Ridge to River is the name of the program. We'll be diving into a little bit, and it draws its name, if you haven't figured it out, from this connection from the ridge tops that surround the valley down to the river itself. I assume it's this one. Well, we'll just go from here, I think. This was taken by Vince Frankie, videographer. Yeah, that's a great one. Cool. So I just wanted to situate us a little bit. This is a map of the Mad River watershed, and I wanted to put this here just to sort of, this star is yes tomorrow, but just to have us recognize this. This valley has a very deep history down to the bedrock geology, right? So millions of years ago, ancient seabed was folded up, giving rise to the Northfield Range and the Green Mountain Range. Glaciers moved through, deposited the superficial geology, the top level soil, and then something like 14,000 years of ecology have sort of built on top of that. And that's the context in which we talk about flood resilience. We talk about the development that might happen in this community, the elements that will sort of impact whether or not our communities are resilient over the long run. Wonderful. So Friends of the Mad River, as Britton introduced, is a nonprofit organization. I actually think it's 1990. I think I misspoke. We're well into our 30th or third decade. And we have a long history here in the Mad River Valley working with partners like Yes Tomorrow for our mission to steward the Mad River Valley, healthy land, clean water for this community and for future generations. We often emphasize this idea of learning, conserving, and celebrating as sort of core tenets of our work, and we try and bring that to all of our programs, including Ridge to River. So we'll start with a little bit of celebration. So the conversations in Ridge River and caring about this community and any of the work that we do starts with our shared values, our shared experience as a community. And it's those sort of qualities of life that bring us together at first and allow us to work together in the collaborative spirit of this program. So everything from, wonderful agricultural history, spending time outdoors in the winter, enjoying time in the stream, our wonderful craft food. All of these things are aspects of our life that really set the tone for this community. And, beer and cheese have made appearances at a few of our Ridge to River gatherings in the past. So there's a lot to love about life here in the Valley, and those values sort of run deep. But there's also some realities about life here in the Valley that are a little bit less charming. And we can see those in the case of large climate-driven events like Tropical Storm Irene, or the October 2019 storm, or even this summer where the river sort of got right up to the banks and we had a near miss. And so events like that set another tone for this community, for us to be considering the sort of the consequences of life here. The river doesn't always agree with where we put our roads and our towns. And that is true for cumulative smaller scale storms as well. We've seen a lot of sort of microburst storms over the years, washing out individual roads, having pretty significant impact on single tributaries, and similarly, just the wear and tear on driveways and our dirt roads and our infrastructure over time can lead to some serious storm and flood related impacts. So that's the context that led to the formation of the Ridge to River Coalition. So in 2015, a group of sort of motivated, interested community members from across the 5 towns in the watershed attended the Leahy Summit, which was really focused on resilience, how you build it in your community. And that is a broad topic. It can cover a wide range of areas. And this group started to focus in specifically on this idea of managing stormwater. And so while we are looking at flood resilience, this group really started to focus on particularly the way the landscape can or cannot absorb storms that come through our area. The coalition was town representatives, business community, nonprofit partners, consultants, and researchers. And that has been true since 2015 through today. I just wanted to show this diagram. This came from a memo following the tropical storm Irene in 2011, and just sort of giving broad strokes, identifying areas where we should be considering development, where we shouldn't be considering development, and some of the strategies we might use. And you can see up the very tippy top is this managed stormwater, and that's everywhere in the watershed. And that really became a sort of hallmark of Ridge to River and the efforts that came out of it. This idea that everyone in the watershed, sort of, no matter where you are on the landscape, there's something you can do to sort of help mitigate the impacts of some of these storms. So we slow down rainwater and snow melt and help it sink into the ground. We're less vulnerable in large events. We reduce infrastructure costs, and we benefit from cleaner swimming holes and groundwater. And we also see less cumulative sort of impact when we're able to appropriately sink water in. The little pig is for money. I just was this is a little aside, but I was in a meeting this morning and we're talking about the 6-to-1 ratio that FEMA often comes out with when they talk about investing in resilience. So they sort of save $6 for every $1 spent in resilience. And we don't have those exact figures for the Mad River Valley, but in principle, that's the idea that, an investment up front helps reduce the overall cost from damages long term. Here's a wonderful diagram. And the idea is really to take that original picture of the watershed that I shared and try and think about what in that geology, what in that layering can function like a sponge to absorb the water where it lands, in contrast to impermeable surfaces like driveways or rooftops. So as part of the Ridge to River Coalition, we went through a process of sort of learning, some deep investigation into the watershed, where we worked with some consultants and researchers to really sort of get the best data that we had, and then try and turn that into actionable items that we could pursue as a community. So I'm going to run through some of the sort of lessons that we learned through that process. So the Mad River Valley is 437 miles of roads, 290 miles are public, meaning that the other third are private, right? So again, the idea that private individuals, people around the valley, have the sort of opportunity to act as stewards in managing stormwater. So 40% of private roads have slopes greater than 15%. If you've ever tried to walk up a 15% slope, you know that is a ravine. That is an incredibly steep slope and incredibly vulnerable to erosion. We also have road densities similar to Chittenden County, where Burlington is. And if you look at a road map of the Mad River Valley, you see it's crisscrossed every which way with roads. And each one of those roads is effectively not just transportation for your car, but transportation for water. They're impermeable surfaces, and water will just flow right across the surface. So the flip side to the impermeable surfaces, we can think about forests acting as a sponge. The trees themselves absorb water. The duff layer and that layer on the ground that builds up over time also absorbs water and slows it down. And yet we have seen a decline in forest cover in the Mad River Valley. The research that we did showed from 2001 to 2011, roughly 500 acres of forest was converted into non-forest cover. And so that was using sort of satellite level. So we don't know exactly what that conversion, what the cause of it was, or what it was exactly converted to, but we know that it went from forest to non-forest. In Vermont, that rate from 2007, 2017 was 1,500 acres per year. So 15,000 acres in a decade. And so, that is in contrast to the historical trend we've seen in Vermont. We've seen reforestation happening for the last century, and we're just sort of rounding the corner into deforestation. So as we lose this forest cover, we lose one of our most vital tools for absorbing storms. And then back to the world of impermeable surfaces, we get to development, we get to housing. And so a lot of the development that happens in the valley is sort of very small scale, and it falls below regulatory thresholds, which means, again, it's sort of on those private landowners. It's their decisions and their opportunity to sort of act as the stewards for managing the water that lands on their property. So we've sort of learned these lessons, and then we went out and we ran some community forums with the public to sort of get input on their take on flood resilience and stormwater, and sort of caring for this valley and acting as stewards of the watershed. And luckily, people in this valley care quite a bit, right? 100% of survey respondents care about clean water. That's a nice number. And many residents are aware. 85% have reported actively trying to minimize erosion and runoff on their properties, right? We live in a very steep watershed, and so people are often directly experiencing the consequences of that landscape and of the storms that move through our area. However, action that people can take is often limited by either the deep knowledge of how you might manage stormwater, or by the resources to actually do the work. So moral of the story, small dispersed problems, a little clearing over there, a little road over there, an undersized culvert over there can add up to a lot of damage in a big storm. But small and dispersed changes can add up to a little good. So if we look across the watershed and we look at the cumulative impact of people's decisions to manage stormwater, we can sort of turn that tide. So here we have our youngest volunteer digging a swale on the side of the road. So those are the lessons learned. And so we asked ourselves, what can we do as a coalition, as a group of people? What kind of tools do we have? How can we empower ourselves and the broader community to take action? And so we built this action framework, which is on our website, friendsofmadriver.org. And it's deep. There's a lot in there. We spent a bunch of time getting into the nitty-gritty of different potential programs, different potential funding sources, different actors and what actions they might take. So I'm just going to highlight a few of them here, and then we can dig into it later in the Q&A. If you want to pull up the website, I'd be happy to explore. So we looked at developing stormwater master plans for specific sites. And so these partners at these sites were often the schools or particular businesses, or other organizations in the valley. And so the Ridge to River Coalition built this action framework, but we didn't, as a group, always lead on the development of all of these projects. So, that partnership, even beyond the coalition, was sort of critical to the advancement of some of the projects that you see here, which these are sort of rain gardens, a retention basin, and a rock-lined ditch. This little rain guard here is outside Harwood. And so, each one of these was also matched with a sort of a core community partner who was able to drive that work forward. We also developed stormwater master plans for all 5 towns in the valley. Those stormwater master plans identified the top 20 sites for stormwater management. And these are, sites where a significant amount of runoff was either heading into the river or there was a high risk of erosion. And we were able to at least identify some preliminary opportunities to sink water in at or near those sites. I'll just also say that 5 of the sites that were identified for each town were given 30% design, which is a slightly more robust design. And some of those are in the works of being implemented. And hopefully all of them will be. We also hosted these events called road roundtables in partnership with the town road crews and the town select board members. And these brought together those road crews for conversation about what was working for them, what challenges they saw. And it also allowed the coalition itself to learn from people who are dealing with the consequences of stormwater management on the ground. And so this is an ongoing effort. And we have thought about expanding this actually, and Luke will talk about this here in a minute, but we've thought about expanding this to look at other groups who have sort of direct on the ground knowledge about how this landscape actually functions. But this proved to be one of our more valuable initiatives. So we also, when this is around 2018, 2019, we started to really think about this question of private drive. So a third of the road systems are privately held. What are some of the hurdles to sort of implementing projects or best practices or doing the maintenance required to sort of reduce vulnerability at those sites? And so we went through this sort of valley-wide scoping project. We worked with some engineering partners to analyze the sort of most bang for your buck private road projects, and we did design for 6 sites. And then we ended up doing even further work at our top 3 sites. We reached a wall here, though, and it's important to point out because these projects get quite expensive, and the current sort of funding climate is not interested in funding projects on private land. And so as this stands, this is a real hurdle for us collectively as a community and as a state to overcome, and a bit of an opportunity for private landowners to come together and think about how they might, collaboratively fund things like replacing culverts or regrading driveways or establishing new ditches. I'll scoot along and I'll get back to that in a moment. So again, small dispersed changes can add up to a lot of good, and it takes homeowners too. And so recognizing that we need not only organizational partners and not only town partners, but we also need to be engaging individual private landowners on their parcels. We built the Storm Smart program. So this launched in 2018. Is actually what I was hired to build with Friends of the Mad River before I became the director. And the program works one-on-one with landowners. It's a free program to identify opportunities to what I like to call spongify their properties, right? And bring resources to bear where appropriate. And so we've visited something like 120 properties in the valley since 2018 and found, opportunities from just letting the grass grow a little bit longer to, installing dry wells and or rebuilding whole driveways and, right sizing culverts. And it's really running this program has really convinced me that there are opportunities for each of us, each property to have a positive impact. And so those are just some of the highlights of some of the programs that came out of the Ridge to River Coalition. And, we went through this process of doing research and sort of collaborating as a group, finding, establishing that action framework, and had success. And as these programs started to roll out, as these efforts sort of grew beyond the coalition itself, that coalition started to ask itself, well, this worked, so what next, right? What else can we do as a group? And the conclusion that we came to is that we should sort of broaden the envelope and look at climate resilience, recognizing that the climate is changing. We'll continue to be working on stormwater, but also look at flood resilience in other areas, look at, forest connectivity, look at habitat blocks, what have you. And so that was in 2021 that we started to make that pivot. And so we, slowly built the pieces together, and that ultimately led Friends of the Mad River to hire Luke Foley as our climate and engagement manager. And so he came on in July, and since then has been sort of working to develop what we're thinking of as Ridge to River 2.0. So I'll hand it over to you, Luke.
Do you want me to walk over to that side, or are you gonna just, okay, great. So part of, I think, what is most important to think about is that this Ridge River Coalition only works if everybody is working together. And that means all 5 of the towns that are in our watershed. So that's Warren, Waitsfield, Fayston, Moortown, and Duxbury. And so when we talk about collaboration, that means that we're actively soliciting the feedback, the input from all of those diverse people, those different stakeholders in all of those communities, and thinking about how we can undertake these issues that impact us all. Because what happens in Warren ultimately does impact downstream in Moortown. And so the idea was, we had a lot of success. We developed some really cool programs. We had really great work that brought community members together. And we knew that there was an opportunity to take broader action. And so right now, the focus of Ridge River 2.0 is really this idea that we're going to broaden this idea of resilience beyond flood and think about climate resilience and what that means in a changing climate. And the way that that looks is, sort of outlined in Vermont's Climate Action Plan, which is a really lovely to read 274-page document that is super dense. And so the point is that a lot of times the input or the ideas or the impetus for trying to do something like this is not super user friendly. And what that means for a community is that we're given these sort of broad topics and then asked, okay, go do great things. And that's a little messy as I'm learning right now. But really, we can look at each of these categories and we can see that there are things that we can improve on. There are things that the people in Waitsfield and Fayston could collaborate on. And in doing so, we give ourselves a better opportunity to be more resilient into the future. The Vermont Climate Action Plan goes hand in hand with the Vermont Climate Assessment. And for anybody who's seen that, something we can expect living right here in the Mad River Valley is that it's anticipated that within 100 years, the climate here will look more like the climate in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Georgia. And that means the number of days above 90 degrees each summer, the number of days below freezing. And what that means for us is not just like ski season might be potentially threatened or harmed, but it means that we're going to have a wider range of storms. We're going to have more storms of over 2 inches of rain, which we saw a lot of this past summer. We're going to see more ice storms. And, if you think about the winter where the roads are consistently changing, we're going to have a lot more freeze thaw cycles. And so being proactive and thinking about what that means for all of the facets of what it means to live in our community is really what we're focused on. So what we've done so far is we've started to bring together some of those folks that were part of the original Ridge to River that had this impetus, this idea that they wanted to try to broaden the expanse of what we were doing. We have meetings, we sit down, and we take action. We start brainstorming different ways that this community could actively address climate change through all of the actions we take on a daily basis. And the idea isn't that we're creating new work, but that we're creating a new lens through which we perceive the work that we do. So every decision that we make in each of the 5 communities in our watershed is through this lens of climate change and how we're all being impacted. And we ended up coming up with 3 specific working groups. So rather than focusing on buildings and energy or green space and forests, we sort of scaled it down into these different areas. Smart growth, and I'll go into these a little bit more in detail later. Healthy spaces and beings, and community education and workforce development. In order to be successful and thrive into the future, we know that these are areas that we have to address. And so what we did is we took a lot of great ideas that our team had developed, which you see up here on all these sticky notes, and then we started to use an action priority matrix to try to figure out what are the objectives that we think are most important. What can we do right now? What's going to be more longer term? What are things that maybe seem like they might be a great idea, but ultimately aren't having the biggest impact? And we're starting to filter through that list of ideas. And this, for me, really strikes home. You can see it says smart growth with a question mark. I grew up in Colorado, and this is from the Front Range of Colorado, right? And every time I go home, I'm shocked by the fact that what used to be expansive prairie is now cookie cutter houses as far as you can see. That's soulless growth. That is growth without a lot of forethought. And it's just been people who have felt like they, there weren't many options. And so they grew in the fastest possible way with the least amount of hurdles in the way. And something we can expect, which we saw to an extent in this community with COVID, is we should expect for our population to continue to grow. That is something that we're expecting. There's a combination of what are called climate migrants or climate refugees. And that is really sort of this idea that people are going to be moving here. If they're someone who's migrating here, it's often because they're choosing to come here as a result of just wanting to have, cooler summers or, slightly different winters than where they have. whereas a refugee is someone who's actively displaced by some type of climate event. And so, you know, in order for us not to just have this like rampant development, and in order for us not to have this continued deforestation, we have to rethink the way that we want our community to grow. We have to do some visioning about what we want it to look like, to be more inclusive, to be the type of place that we all still want to live. And there we go. And that means, and these are some of the ideas that right now are being focused on as we talk about this idea of smart growth. So we recognize that, you know, a lot of the places that we could build right now are super steep. They're on hillsides just because of our topography. So we know that we need to have more concentrated development. And by doing that, we allow people to have a more walkable or bikeable sort of active transportation. We want less rural sprawl. We want to have more affordable housing options for people in this community. And that's something that's eye-opening if you look at the data around how many people can actually afford to live in this place that spend their time working here. We know that we want to try to be creative with the ways that we're transporting people around, because some of the other like forms of transit aren't working. Our highest energy output is transportation. And I see it every day. I ride bikes to school with my kids, and every single car that goes past me on the way out of town, probably to go to work, is a single occupant driver. And so, and you know, and this is where a place like Yes Tomorrow comes in, is the more people that we can train in sustainable and energy efficient housing designs and building, the more that we're going to have an opportunity to be, you know, one of the places that's prototyping new technologies. When we talk about healthy spaces and beings, this is something that we really deliberated the language around this. And those spaces are broad, right? That could be our outdoor spaces, but it can also be our indoor spaces. So with a push, you know, Brad Cook, who I think many of you probably know here, often talks about the idea that one of the biggest issues from like really tight, you know, energy efficient homes is sometimes air quality, and people not being aware of that. So just helping people to better understand, not only as you like weatherize your house, but what are some of the other things that you could be positively trying to impact. And the beings is, you know, more than just human beings, right? There are a lot of beings that live in this landscape. And sometimes we think about ourselves in relationship to the landscape, and we forget about all of those other creatures and critters that really are extremely important to the quality of the ecosystem and the way that we all are able to live here harmoniously. Some of the other things that we talked about were healthcare and mental health support. Something that we're currently working on as a project is an idea called the Climate Cafe, which is focused not so much on people taking action on climate, but just giving people a space to come together and sort of talk about their emotions, talk about the reality of living in the environment that we live in today, and working with some of our school partners and some partners with UVM to be able to bring that to our community so that people have an avenue to sort of express what that's like for them. And also just celebrating the fact that we do have wonderful local ag and looking at how we can diversify, how we can open that up. One of the benefits in a way of climate change is that it changes some of our growing seasons and maybe enables us an opportunity to grow things that we wouldn't have been able to grow historically. So thinking proactively about how we can change in our economy to be able to be successful in a future that is slightly different from what we see now. Another huge area of emphasis is community education, and that really means a lot of things. One, we recognize that in order for all of those individual landowners to take action, they have to be informed. They have to understand what they can do to their driveway. They have to know what they can do to their property. And there are only so many storm smart consultations that one can do in any given calendar year. So how do we build programming that informs the masses about the types of things that they can do to help themselves out? We are actively working a lot in schools. My background was as an educator. So this is me working with first and second graders at Waitsfield School. And we had been doing a unit study on erosion. And they're drawing maps about how they would build and design their villages around a river, knowing some of the changes that happen in order to make for a safe and resilient community. And their ideas are brilliant. They're super cool. They're going to be living in tree houses on stilts everywhere. It's pretty exciting. Another way of doing this is not just through like the more traditional workshops or education forums, but also just creating events to celebrate where we live and what we do. So this is not an image from our community, but it's an idea of, we're currently working to try to bring together like some film series to bring climate focused films that sort of embody the types of activities that people love to do here. So these are ski focused films, but through a climate advocacy lens, and bringing people here to talk about that. And really what this is meant to do, all of this community education, is that in order to take collective climate action, it takes every single person. And so if we host a meeting and there's 15 people involved, that's great that we have 15 advocates, 15 people that are willing to go take action. But what we really need is a little bit from every single person. So we're trying to reach communities that haven't historically been a part of these conversations. Those might be communities that are historically marginalized. They might be communities that are underrepresented. And so what we're trying to do is use the different ways that we're educating our community to try to figure out whose voices do we need to involve in this climate conversation. The workforce development piece, as we discuss what that looks like, one of the biggest things that we see is that there will have to be a changing climate economy. And with that, there are lots of ways that that might look. And rather than being reactive to the changing climate, we want to be proactive in thinking about what those solutions might look like in the future. And some of that, like a lot of our conversation actually revolved around the idea of like sustainable building and design, and the fact that, currently in order to install solar panels on properties, people are bringing in crews from Maine and from other various places. And if you, like I worked in education for a lot of years, we know that our technical skills and our trades we're having a really hard time filling a lot of those positions. A lot of people are aging out, and there's not a lot of interest in coming into those professions. And so the idea is by working with local schools, by working with community partners, we get people interested and engaged and understanding that this is a valuable asset that they can bring to their community. And not only do we want them to do that, but we also want to see like this idea that people of all ages can continue learning, can continue growing, and continue maybe shifting directions to be adaptable to the future. And so we wanted to put a lot of emphasis on making sure that the community that we have is a place where people can work, can live, can have a great quality of life, and where they're always engaged in the type of community that we want to collectively hold. So some of our ongoing projects, things that have recently launched, and this is really mostly out of capacity. It's a lot of my work, and then we have another person who works with AmeriCorps who is doing a tremendous job named Anome. And we've launched a number of different activities. So we have an expert series. Each month we're taking some type of outdoor activity meant to try to connect the local community with that space. So last month we did a fall foliage hike where we talked about our changing forests and what's happening to our trees as a result of climate change. We have a person coming in who's an expert in floodplains and is going to be giving a talk in the month of November. We're planning winter tracking and talking about animal hibernation cycles in December. And so we've got a lot of those coming up, which should be really fun. Anome has launched a book club, and that is going to be starting at Warren Library this month. I guess it's November now. And the first book that they're going to be reading is Braiding Sweetgrass, which is by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is an indigenous scientist and it just does an incredible job of teaching people new ways to connect with the land. I mentioned the film events a little bit earlier in the school programming, and that school programming is happening from kindergarten all the way up to high school juniors and seniors at this point in time. Another project that we just sort of want to float because we're really excited about this. 25 years ago, in 1998, the Friends of the Mad River and a number of collective partners put together something called the Crucible of Change. And what they did with that was sort of an ethnographic study through a lot of interviews with some of the old timers. We're not going to play this, with a lot of the old timers who lived in the valley and had seen tremendous change over the course of their lifetimes. And if you listen to this, it's broken down into like 10 to 12 minute segments. In total, it's about an hour and a half. And it's just an incredible insight into what life was like in the early 1900s, how it changed as a result of all of the, everything from the ski industry to different companies coming and going. And what we're attempting to launch in partnership and collaboration with a lot of other groups is the idea of revisiting the crucible of change, of doing some ethnographic studies, of doing interviews with community members, and really trying to bring together a lot of voices to capture this moment in time, to understand what it's like to live here, to put in a time capsule the stories of the people that are in our community right now, some of the challenges that we face, and some of the opportunities that we have looking forward. And so that is something that we're really excited about. It's likely, not a lot of promises at this point, but we're working with some folks at Harwood to potentially get some youth voice involved with that, maybe having some of those high school students be involved with the process of conducting those interviews. And also, just last week, we gave a presentation at the Senior Center. So there's a lot of seniors who are totally amped to get in there and share their stories about what it's like to live here and the changes they've seen in their lifetime. So those are some things that you can look out for. There are lots of diverse ways that we're attempting to reach out to the community to bring in a lot of different people to understand the work that we're engaged in. And we're also really open to partnerships. So, if you have ideas or thoughts or suggestions for things that you think the community would really benefit from, it definitely could be something that we would be interested in. So at this point, this is contact info for both Ira and myself. Our emails are pretty simple. And we can leave that there. I know that there is some time for Q&A. And I think it's really awesome to be here. I've been a big fan of Yes Tomorrow. So I just thanks for the opportunity to come and share. And I think at this point, if there are questions that folks have. Well, it's complicated, actually. There's not an official senior center. There is, so they have a facility that's, I think it's owned by Downstreet, and they rent it out or lease it out for certain meals. And so it's a great deal. If you're ever around on a Monday morning, you can go in and get a great breakfast deal. And it's all volunteers who are serving, volunteers cooking and cleaning. They use some of that money to fund their Meals on Wheels programs. And then they also serve lunches on Tuesdays. And we happen to be their sort of their entertainment after lunch on Tuesday. So it's right down kind of in that strip between like Northfield Savings Bank and China Fund. There's a number of buildings there. And they're really interested in lots of partnerships, and they're doing some really cool things. Yoga for seniors, and Onome just is proposing a big program to bring nature to the seniors more frequently, because mobility is often a challenge and they're not able to access a lot of the sites that many of us know and love here. So how do we bring more opportunities to that specific population?
Yeah. The other thing I just want to mention is a lot of our seniors live on the end of long, windy private roads, on the end of driveways. And, there's something called the Social Vulnerability Index, which sort of measures the risk that different communities face. And one of the measurements is it looks at age, but one of the other measurements is what happens if you have a disaster that interrupts transportation. And so Warren, Waitsfield, and Fayston all score highly, which is a negative score on social vulnerability index for those two pieces. And so when we think about addressing that somewhat intractable question of private roads and how to make sure they're well maintained, it is also specifically for the benefit of our older population. Yeah, and I mean, I could go on this point forever, because it's a sticky thing, and at the state level we're talking about it, and there's different funding mechanisms, sort of slowly eking out for it. But a lot of it is just deferred maintenance, which is this unfortunate sort of passing of the buck, right? Where people moved out at some point in the past and they didn't do the maintenance, and then the people moved in, they didn't know what the maintenance that was supposed to happen was, and you go through a stretch of a couple of years without a big storm, and you don't think anything needs to happen. And then all of a sudden you have to spend $10,000 and all you can do is replace the culvert you had before and not put in the new structure. So that is a real challenge for us to continue to address. And I'll just say, even as we are doing Ridge to River 2.0, we're also going to continue the work of Ridge to River 1.0. And some of that work has sort of moved into, as I said, like different partnerships, the towns or particular organizations. Some of it is now shifted leadership because of the state. There's something called the municipal road general permits that have come into existence since Ridge to River was formed, that requires the towns to inventory their roads and look for undersized culverts and things like that. And some of that work exists within Friends of the Mad River as an organization. And so, depending on the particular aspects, it's all still moving forward. Other questions?
About
so I can only speak to that anecdotally. Yeah. Yeah. The question was about whether or not groups of landowners on private roads kept a reserve fund to actually do the maintenance or the work required to upkeep those roads. And my answer is only anecdotally. We haven't done a sort of broad survey of this, but I've gone out to dozens of these private road networks, and the answer is no. Basically, most people are just not thinking about it. And sort of then a big storm comes along and it's shocking and difficult. There are a few cases where there are private road associations, and I've seen those groups be the most well prepared for these kinds of situations. The other, even smaller group of people, maybe 3 of these networks I've seen around the road, someone on the road owned a tractor and was able, and grading equipment, and was able to just do the maintenance themselves. And those, if you have a tractor, your road can be in great shape all the time.
One of the things that I've also learned, so Ira spoke about the road crews and the work that they're doing, and one of the things that came to light through their work was that one of their biggest frustrations was that they operate typically under what are considered best practices for how to maintain a road, and because so many of our roads are privately owned, they're not always being maintained by someone who knows those best practices or is doing those things. And so oftentimes their work is impacted. If a road washes out into the middle of a public road, it impacts their ability to do their job. And it's likely just because someone didn't know how they could be doing something differently or better. And so that's something that we're actively thinking about. And specifically to talk, that is one of the goals of this group with Ridge to River. It just came up in a meeting on Monday, is we know that we really need to go out and talk to different community members, whether it's on private roads or about some of these specific issues, and understand their problems and what their capacity to do something about it might be.
Being able to offer the right of they have in our plan that work some of the right ways into your home quote and larger than something that and then be able to if it's a larger.
Yeah. So the question is about
wiping down, tree covers.
Yeah.
Really impact wildlife, but still it might,
So just to reiterate, the question was about like essentially installing some kind of infrastructure using the right-of-ways that could retain or slow or absorb water. And that's essentially what the stormwater master plans identified. Mostly they are they're not small, 10 by 10 rain gardens. They are large swales or series of swales, or areas where water is diverted, off of a road into, a large wooded area. And so those do exist, and they're sort of in the hopper with the different towns. And so they also are in the hunt for funding. And so as, money becomes available for those different projects, they get pursued.
Is there any funding that you see on the state side that you do to the municipal side?
Yep.
From federal infrastructure?
Yes, yeah, definitely. So the ARPA funds, American Recovery Plan Act, right? Some of that money it sort of filtered down through and made it into our valley towns, and some of that is moving some of these projects forward. They're fairly complicated projects because they often cross multiple parcels, or they'll involve private land, right? Almost all the land in the valley is privately held, and so we need to be engaging those landowners as well in this process. And it maybe in an ideal world it would fit in the right of way, but we didn't find that to be the case. And as I pointed out at the very beginning, the geology of the valley puts a lot of constraints on us. We don't actually have a lot of very permeable soil, and so there's not a lot of places to put it, which essentially augments the value of the forested landscape, right? Because that's something that can actually hold the water, as opposed to the glacially smeared on till that is not able to absorb that water.
Yeah, I was out with 3rd and 4th graders in Moortown yesterday, and we were digging soil horizon pits, which is a way to sort of assess what types of soils a particular area has. And you could barely go an inch in any of the locations that they chose. So 5 out of 5 sites had a lot of clay, which anybody who's built here or has owned a house here knows that about the area. So, when you think not all soils are, equivalent in their ability to absorb. And so when we have a high percentage of clay, that does impact, because that can in some ways act like a impermeable surface. Water just transfers across the top of it as well.
As your organization thought of or come up with or heard any great ideas about the problem of transportation, is it something that I struggle with, where it's impossible to carpool people and get from point A to point B? I know the matters of path and talked on that, like a commuter route sort of thing, so that's great for bikes. But I like trying to think of a way getting people around other than single person and vehicle.
So I'll respond to so the question is about, has our organization sort of have any brilliant ideas about addressing the transportation challenges in the valley? And I'll respond to the history of that, and then I'll let Luke talk about anything that has come up in his work. But historically, Friends of the Mad River as an organization, as a watershed group, has focused predominantly on the river, its surrounding areas, the sort of traditional environmental issues that you would think about. Not so much this world of smart growth, not so much these issues of development. We've often provided a bit of a ballast for those conversations in the communities, but not led them. And frankly, we probably won't lead them as an organization. That's probably going to sort of stay outside of our scope. But what we've seen is that there is a need and demand in this community to just have facilitated conversations, bringing the partners together who ultimately will lead on this, right? Empowering other leaders in the community to connect with one another. So hopefully that's happening.
Yeah, no, I mean, so on some of the ideas, and the thing with, like, even though we've subcategorized into smart growth and healthy spaces and beings, like, there's still overlap. So on each of those 3 different, areas of potential opportunity, people were talking about microtransit. So for instance, the seniors that we were talking about, they don't have like a typical shuttle that goes around town, but they do have an EV that delivers seniors when they need rides. So the idea of like microtransit as opposed to mass transit, in the wintertime we have the Mad Bus, but they're limited locations. And oftentimes those locations aren't where the people who could benefit from it most are living. And so the question is, how do we, and this is part of that like smart growth. Like if we are able to create planning that allows for maybe more concentrated, affordable housing, and there's a lot of things that go into that. But maybe that means that that allows for more of this mass transportation. And I think there's obviously ways to be super innovative. You know, Misha, who is the executive director of the Mad River Path, in order to communicate like how at times unbike friendly the valley can be, he took a bunch of people from VTrans on bicycles down Route 100. You know, and then you see what it's like to have a narrow shoulder. And so some of that is experiential, you know, like giving people an opportunity to see how our community is impacted by some of, you know, the history and by the topography, helps people to better understand why it might be important for us to develop different forms of infrastructure. And that's been an ongoing conversation for years. I think, you know, there's an initiative called MRV Moves in 2012, which did the study of like, where do we need active transportation? Where are the corridors that we want to focus on? And now sometimes that planning and those projects just require the right champion, the right timing to sort of take the lead on it. And I think that that's like, to speak to our role is not being the champion of each of those causes. It's just being one of the catalysts to try to bring people together, and then recognizing that there's a lot of empowerment that needs to happen, that people need to understand what role they could take to positively impact the way that we all address climate here.
Now, I would just add, and not to be the Debbie Downer, but our other role in there is to be a voice for the river, the tributaries, the sort of ecological health and well-being of the valley. So even as we talk about, you know, a Route 100 corridor, okay, well, that's in the river corridor, right? What does that mean? It's not to say it's a bad idea, but it's just to say there are consequences to those ideas. And Friends of the Mad River can sort of bring that expertise to bear in those conversations. And the more we foster the collaborative spirit with our partners, the easier it is to have some of those tough conversations.
And he was talking about whole systems approach thinking of like no one problem and no one solution is solely alone, and like in order to solve one thing, you have to take a broader scale approach.
Yeah.
Interesting to hear that from you as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And have doubled down.
Yeah. Yeah.
All the towns in Mad River Valley have some type of ordinance with commercial and residential development. And you hold water on the side.
So there are state level zonings around this. There's a 3-acre permit, which is if you have 3 acres of impermeable surface, you have to go through a whole permitting process. Eventually that will become a 1-acre permit process. So you have 1 acre of impermeable, but this is where we come back to this idea that like below a certain threshold, there really isn't a lot of regulatory, you know, leverage, right? And so as far as I understand it, the answer is generally no for most of these small residential properties. That said, all of the towns are sort of well informed on this topic now. It's actually pretty impressive to talk to select board members who this was sort of alien concept, stormwater management, and now they're as expert as anyone. And they do talk, you know, they talk to new landowners, they talk to developers. And, you know, it definitely, as towns go through modernizing zoning, you know, it creeps in there. And that's sort of part of a long-term strategy, is to inform some of those local policies and hopefully incorporate some of these sort of best management practices for stormwater.
Each of the town plans actually accounts for some of the things that we're discussing. You know, all of the town plans say that they want to limit, like try to prohibit building on slopes steeper than 25%, unless it's related to ski industry, essentially. And they want to strictly regulate anything between 15 and 25% slopes. And I think part of what the group that I'm working with is coming to understand is that that's a really tough thing to enforce or regulate. So you can have like ideals for what you want to try to accomplish, and if the town doesn't have the capacity, so some of the conversation is like, do the towns need to share a couple of positions that do some of the permitting? And you know, one of the select boardmen in Warren told me that he would love to require a storm smart consultation that went with every building permit, but there's nobody to actually, you know, go and make sure that that happens. So there's the ideal, and then there's the ability to regulate these things you set in place. And one other point that was made by one of our coalition members, which I think is really interesting and a point well taken, is that sometimes permitting processes, and the more complicated they get, become more and more of an equity issue the further you go along. And so something as a community we have to be mindful of is that, you know, every time you make another requirement to be a homeowner or a property owner in a community, it might be limiting people's ability to access that. And so how do we ensure high standards for what building and growth looks like, and at the same time make it as inclusive as possible for as many people as possible that want to live in our community?
And also, a developer who does have enforce that he is actually cheap in their development, but it doesn't then even compete on downstream.
I think this, I would say, like, broadly speaking, I think that some of those state level zoning sort of changes are going to be significantly impactful in sort of like the net impacts statewide. And I also think, you know, there's unfortunately always the reality of asking for forgiveness and not for permission. You know, like this is why we always pair, you know, these sort of wonky policy conversations with conversations about education and community engagement and sort of establishing shared community values throughout, right? So that when someone comes to me, they're like, oh, I'm coming here because you guys take care of stormwater, because you do that as a work problem. Hopefully sort of head it off at the source. Right?
Yeah, that was a cool part that, you know, Barry is considering right now in stormwater storage in the town.
Mm-hmm.
Good example locally is sort of in its nascent stages. I was looking at Irisville as an area of concentrated development. Irisville is also rife with wetlands, and those wetlands serve a very important stormwater retention as well as all sorts of other sort of ecological roles. And in the process of sort of creating a master plan for Irisville, the planning district is starting with the wetlands, and they're doing that because of this long history of you know, ecological values, right, in the valley, and partners like my rivers are being at the table, consistently championing, you know, those spaces. And so, to me, that's like this sort of perfect cumulative example of the, you know, wonky permitting world, the, you know, the shared community values, and hopefully eventually the actual implementation of something that meets this sort of broad array of community values while also protecting some of our most sort of fragile ecological resources. Yeah.
So I was interested, you had a data point in there about 500 acres of forest we lost. And I was wondering if you had any data related to the river that relates to extremes over like the last 10 or 20 years related to high water marks, as well as the quality of the water.
We have the data, but not analyzed, right? So in Moortown, there's the USGS gauge, and that measures stream height and discharge flow of water to the river, and that's always happening. You can go to the website and look it up at any given time. So we could go back and look at that and see what the highs and lows are. So every summer, Friends of Mad River run something called Mad River Watch. We have volunteers that go out and do water quality monitoring as well. And so whenever they put out a report in the summer, we sort of compare, you know, flow trends that summer to years past. And you know, generally tracks with statewide data. When it's dry in Vermont, the river is low. And when it rains a lot, the river is high. The river is quite flashy, which is very apparent from the stream gauge. You know, if you get a big storm up in Warren, you can just sort of like watch it pulse out. And then in terms of water quality data, you know, we learned lessons essentially over the history of our Mad River Watch program that remain true, which really boil down to we've collectively as a community dealt with point source pollution, so that would be like a pipe directly putting a pollutant into the water, but we haven't dealt with non-point source pollution, which is when a storm, you know, crosses the landscape and water sort of brushes off, picking up pollutants, and they go in the river that way. And so what we know is that things like E. coli are higher in the 24 to 48 hours after a rainstorm. And, you know, that can come from a number of sources on the landscape. Otherwise, the river is, in terms of pollutant load, is doing well, basically. We have other measurements of phosphorus and nitrogen, and our base load levels are basically fine. One of the real challenges facing the river, though, is call it sunlight pollution. Basically, the water temperature is much too high throughout the summer, and probably throughout the year. We haven't taken overwinter measurements, but you know, brook trout like cool 50-degree water, and we routinely see water temperatures in the high 70s, low 80s throughout the summer, and that is largely to do with direct sort of sun exposure on the river and tributaries itself. So when you have a nice, healthy, robust, what's called a riparian buffer, so a wooded area along the river, it provides shade and cooling for that river. And if you just go on Google Earth and see, you know, much of the main stem of the river and many of the tributaries have fields or lawns right up to the edge. So that's always an active project with Friends of Mad River, is to find opportunities to sort of restore those buffers.
And when you look at knotweed and some of the emphasis that's placed on it in this community, it just outcompetes a lot of saplings for trees that might restore that riparian buffer. So even in certain parts of our landscape, there are trees, there's canopy, but they're aging, they're getting older, and there's not younger trees to replace them, providing that shade for the river. So part of the effort with knotweed is it's about erosion and stabilizing the banks, but it also is about water temperature and providing more shade for, you know, for the river.
We have a couple good projects where you can see that exact dual effort going on. The Austin parcel in Waitsfield, which is on the confluence of the Millbrook and the Mad River, is an active floodplain forest restoration project since 2015, 16, something like that, where we've had year after year planting of trees, active management of the knotweed, and it's cool. We've won awards for it. It's a really great example, but it also is an example of a long-term investment that's needed in sort of restoring some of these side. Any online questions?
Oh, yeah.
No, anyone online have any questions? All right. Thank you all.
Yeah,
for coming
thanks.
and learning a little bit.
Yeah.